right, John Miller, thanks very much. We'll update you as soon as we know something.
I think one of the questions everybody has had all along, speaking of the search for the suspects, is did the people who designed the World Trade Centers have any idea how vulnerable they were? Did they contemplate terrorism and what it could do, and particularly terrorism of this kind? And we're going to find out right now, because we're going to go to Jon Magnusson, who is one of the engineers who helped design the World Trade Centers, and he's joining us from Seattle because that's where his firm is located. And good morning to you, Mr. Magnusson.
Good morning.
What about my question? Did you know how vulnerable the building was?
Well, first of all, there's a couple of points. One, to put it in perspective, the engineering work was done about 35 years ago.
So you're not old enough to have designed that building.
No, I was in the 6th grade when the engineering work was done.
But you were a very precocious 6th grader, obviously.
Actually, it's interesting. It's interesting because the World Trade Center towers and what they represented was one of the reasons that I went into structural engineering, because of the amazing feat that was done there. First, before I even answer the question, I just want to express how the personal sorrow that I feel for this whole situation, because just like every American, I feel that sorrow, but even more, all structural engineers around the country, they dedicate their careers to designing buildings to prevent damage from all kinds of natural hazards. And when you see an unnatural hazard like this, you just have this horrible, sick feeling and helplessness about the whole situation. It's been interesting because I've had emails come to me from people all over the country, architects and engineers, leaving messages on their website, and they basically said that they haven't really heard the right question yet in the interviews. In fact, my partner Ron Klemenzik and I, we have fielded over 60 interviews about the World Trade Center, and the question hasn't been right yet. The question has always been, why did the buildings fall down? And in fact, the question should have been, why did they stand up?
Well, let me get to that. I'm sorry, let me get to that, and I know you want to answer that. But what is so amazing to me, and maybe we get at this issue by doing it this way, what is amazing to me is how orderly was the collapse of the building. Now, when you look at the World Trade Center as it existed before we lost it, what strikes you always when you look at it is the incredible power of the vertical lines in that building, the magnificent vertical pieces of steel that went up. And what strikes me is how well they held, because the building really fell when it went and could not withstand the kind of heat that it did. It really fell right within the parameters of those vertical pieces of steel.
Well, that's exactly right. And the interesting point is, and what a lot of these emails were saying, is that basically 99% of the buildings in our country would have fallen immediately if they had been hit by a 767. And this building was able to stand, both towers actually were able to stand for about an hour after a direct hit. And I mean, this was engineering work done long before I was an engineer, and I look at the work that was led by John Skilling and Les Robertson, and they really did a phenomenal job. And there's literally hundreds and thousands of people that are alive today because the structure held. It was able to take the immediate impact. I mean, if you look at the idea that if an airplane had had its wings blown off and it had flown for another hour, allowing half the people to escape, we wouldn't be asking, well, why did the plane crash? We'd be saying, how did it fly for an hour?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to ask, if I could, Mr. Magnusson, because I know you were there for the redesign after the 1993 bombing, and I want to ask specifically about the fire itself,
right,
because we understand that it wasn't about the structure, it was about the fire's effect on the structure. Right. Did you conceive of something that might be done, looking back, that could have been done, that
right,
could have prevented and insulated a fire from taking the rest of the building down?
Right. All office buildings, all buildings anticipate the possibility of fire. The steel loses its strength. The structural steel in a building loses its strength when it reaches about 1,500 to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. And so in buildings, there are two primary means of defense against that. One is to put fireproofing insulation on the steel so that in the event of a fire, it keeps it from reaching that temperature for 3 or 4 hours. The second thing that is done is to put in sprinkler systems. Now, unfortunately, when you bring a plane into a building, in the side of the building, I am sure that the fireproofing was scraped off and destroyed, and there was bare steel exposed. And the second thing is that when the plane came in, it's very likely that the sprinklers were damaged. But even if they hadn't been damaged, they deliver water. And for a jet fuel fire, you need to have fire-suppressing foam. If you look at airport incidents and aviation accidents, they spray foam on the fire. They don't spray water on the fire.
And these were fully loaded planes, and as John Nance told us yesterday, that's about 14,000 gallons of jet fuel. So the amount of heat that that generates, I wouldn't imagine it damaged the sprinkler system. I just imagine that it vaporized it.
Right, and even if the sprinkler system had been working, that amount of fuel, it would have been throwing drops of water on a bonfire.
Just one question before we let you go,
Sure.
and I appreciate you being with us, but we're about to talk to Dr. Tim Johnson about the quality of air in New York, and one of the things that I'm curious about is the amount of asbestos that was in that building.
I do not know. We actually don't have any of the plans at our office. I mentioned there was 2 lead engineers on this, John Skilling and Les Robertson, and Les Robertson was in the New York office, and all of the plans and specifications are in the New York office. But I do want to say one more thing, and
Sure.
that is that in many of the questions that I have been asked in interviews are along the lines of, well, what does this mean for buildings in the future, and should we be hardening buildings? Should we be putting in foam systems so that if there's a jet fuel fire inside a building, that we can handle it? Well, the question is, as a society, how do we address this problem? And it's not hardening the buildings. It's not trying to design buildings so that they can take impacts from jets. That's not the problem, because even if we could harden the buildings, the problem becomes the fact that these airplanes are becoming flying weapons, and that's the realization. And even if you harden the buildings, then you just have to start thinking about what the other targets would be, sports facilities, any place that a large group of people are gathered. So if we're going to minimize this risk and solve this problem, it's not about the buildings and not about high-rises, but it's about security measures related to airplanes and keeping these weapons out of the wrong people's hands.
I don't think it's possible. I'm not a structural engineer, John, but I don't think it's possible in the wildest imagination of any structural engineer who, as you point out, is dedicated to making these buildings absolutely as safe and as structurally sound as possible. I don't think there's any material in the world that you could build right now that could withstand the attack or the collision with a 767 loaded with 14,000 gallons of jet fuel.
Right, you're right, but I'm not sure a lot of people understand that. And even if you take a 767 and say, we'll design for that, well, then what about a 747? Yeah. And what about a few years from now when the Airbus Super Jumbo comes out? What about that? So that path of thinking that we can reinforce our buildings is the wrong path. And in terms of the national dialogue that will inevitably take place in the months and years ahead, we need to think about keeping these hazards, these unnatural hazards, from the doorsteps of our buildings and the doorsteps of our other gathering places.
Jon Magnusson, it's been good to talk to you, and I appreciate you being with us this morning. I thank you ever so much.
Thank you.